Sir Keir Starmer, Your Majesty.
Your Majesty.
You must be utterly exhausted and nearly on your knees. But not much. Quite a grueling yes. Anyway, you're here.
Yes. It's a very sort of quick changeover.
I know, to say the least. And having to get to grips with everything straight away must be quite exhausting.
Keir Starmer's recent actions have stunned Britain politically. His decision to propose reforms aimed at curbing the monarchy's privileges sent shockwaves through the nation, with many questioning whether the monarchy could lose some of its long-held powers. Starmer believed this move would modernize the country, but it instead triggered widespread protests and divisions. The backlash was so intense that even King Charles III was forced to intervene, showing an unusual level of political engagement. This crisis, unprecedented in recent decades, pushed the government to the brink of a constitutional conflict, signaling that they had crossed a delicate line in the country's political framework. This event marked a turning point, not only for Starmer, but for the entire Labour Party as they grappled with the consequences of their bold and controversial choices.
Prime Minister, thanks for joining us on Sky News today. During the general election, you campaigned on a message of change, of doing politics differently and making yours a government of service. And yet you find yourself caught in a row over the huge amount of freebies you've accepted while leader of the opposition, £107,000, far more than any other MP.
Starmer's proposal to restrict the monarchy's powers quickly sparked a wave of protests across Britain, from royal supporters to ordinary citizens. What Starmer hoped would be a step toward modernizing the country was seen by many as an attack on the nation's core traditions. His actions were perceived as a direct assault on the country's identity, alienating both monarchists and traditional Labour supporters. King Charles III, who usually avoids political entanglements, was forced to intervene, signaling his alarm at the government's moves. Political analysts recognized that this wasn't just another policy shift, but the beginning of a fundamental struggle over Britain's future, potentially reshaping the constitutional balance.
Do you acknowledge that this has undermined your message and reputation, and are you sorry about that?
Well, I think it's important just to put it in its context. Any gift or donation to a politician has to be declared. Everything I've had has been declared. And sitting behind the numbers are some human explanations. So quite a lot of that money was for tickets for football matches. I pay for my own tickets at Arsenal. I've got season tickets. Unfortunately, I can't sit in the stand anymore for security reasons. And the club have said, well, in which case, be our guest in the director's box, if and when there's space. Now, no money changes hands. You can't buy a ticket, but then the register says, well, what's the amount that would be the equivalent, even though you didn't buy the ticket, and that has to be declared. Now, that means if I didn't do that, I couldn't go to Arsenal. I go with my boy. Second example I'll just give you is some of that money was for the loan of a flat during the election period. No money changed hands.
Yes, and that was related to your son.
Yeah, there was no cash adjustment. We had a situation where the election was called, not when we expected it, I think most people. My son happened to be in the middle of his GCSE.
The involvement of King Charles III in the political clash marked a dramatic shift in the situation. Traditionally avoiding direct political conflict, the king was now faced with a clear threat to his position and the monarchy's role. Sources from Buckingham Palace revealed that Charles was deeply troubled by the government's attempts to undermine the monarchy, believing these actions threatened both the institution itself and the country's social cohesion. Initially trying to remain neutral, the king quickly realized that his involvement was unavoidable. His discreet attempts to mediate behind the scenes with both Labour and opposition leaders underscored the seriousness of the crisis, highlighting the need for a resolution to protect the nation's traditions. The rise of Reform UK amidst the turmoil caused by Keir Starmer's actions was an unexpected and striking development. Once seen as a marginal party, Reform UK now found itself at the forefront of British politics, offering a strong alternative to the faltering Labour government. Nigel Farage seized the opportunity, leveraging public discontent to position himself and his party as defenders of British tradition. His pointed critiques of Starmer's policies resonated with disillusioned voters, especially those unhappy with Labour's economic performance and stance on the monarchy. Reform UK gained significant support, attracting a wide range of voters who felt neglected by the traditional parties. Farage's effective messaging transformed Reform UK from a protest movement to a serious political force capable of challenging the political status quo.
That means there are a lot of journalists outside the front door and in the street. I'm not complaining about that. But if you're 13, as my girl is, if you're 16, as my boy is, that's quite hard to navigate when you're concentrating on GCSEs. Now, hear me out, because you put it to me.
Yeah.
So I said, we're going to get you out of here and get you somewhere where you can just study and get to school and back without having to go through all of that. And that's when someone said, well, in which case I can make this flat available to you. It's safe, secure, he can get on with the job. No money exchanged hands, we didn't. No money exchanged hands, but for the registrar, no, but you've put it to me, let me just finish. For the registrar's purposes, he says, well, I know you didn't pay and nobody gave you money, but let's work out what it would have been worth if it had been a commercial transaction, which it wasn't. So I'm not saying, you know, of course I understand why you ask questions, etc. But I do think sometimes it's important just to sort of look behind the number and say...
Within the Labour Party, the political situation was quickly deteriorating as internal divisions became more evident. Following public clashes with the monarchy and poor economic policies, Starmer was criticised not only by the opposition but by members of his own party. Party figures began to openly question his leadership abilities, and demands for his resignation grew louder. What started as quiet dissatisfaction soon turned into open rebellion, with discussions of potential leadership changes gaining traction. The growing internal unrest reflected the party's struggles, as Labour's traditional base, particularly the working class, began to distance itself from Starmer's leadership. Facing mounting pressure, many within the party started to consider distancing themselves from Starmer, believing his departure was crucial for Labour's survival.
No money exchanged hands, we didn't. No money exchanged hands, but for the registrar, no, but you've put it to me, let me just finish. For the registrar's purposes, he says, well, I know you didn't pay and nobody gave you money, but let's work out what it would have been worth if it had been a commercial transaction, which it wasn't. So I'm not saying, you know, of course I understand why you ask questions, etc. But I do think sometimes it's important just to sort of look behind the number and say, what was the human story behind some of this? And I wasn't going to let my son fail or not do well in his GCSEs because of journalists outside our front door. We also, as you know, had protesters outside our front door.
Do you find these questions hard?
The future of British politics, following the crisis ignited by Starmer's controversial actions, became increasingly uncertain. Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, rapidly gained support, positioning itself as the key alternative to Labour. The traditional two-party system, long a staple of British politics, now seemed vulnerable to collapse. Reform UK capitalised on Labour's internal strife and public dissatisfaction, offering a clear alternative to both the established parties. Farage's appeal extended beyond right-wing voters, drawing in those disillusioned with Labour and the Conservatives alike. This shift marked a dramatic change in the political landscape, and the future of the UK seemed poised for a potential realignment, depending on whether Reform UK could sustain its momentum and challenge the traditional parties for control.